Welcome to the Behavioral View.
Hey everyone, would you like to get a CEU for this episode? Listen closely for the announcement of 3 secret words delivered throughout the episode. Take note of those words and we will tell you where to go to get your CEU when the show is over. Hi everybody and welcome to episode 4 of the Behavioral View, where today Carrie and Rick and I are joined by Sarah Litvak of the BHCOE, which I believe stands for Behavioral Health Center of Excellence, correct? Did I get it right?
That's right. You got it right the second time.
Just a little stutter step. But thank you so much for joining us today. We're really excited to talk about credentialing and accreditation issues with you today.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
But before we get into the heavy stuff, let's start with the light as we usually do. What are you guys reading right now?
Well, I had a little bit of time as a parent. It's hard, but my kids are getting older, and I got a lot of books for Christmas and Mother's Day, and one that was gifted to me by my husband. It was supposed to be modeled off of The Time Traveler's Wife, which is a book that I love. It wasn't modeled off of, but the critics all say compare it to, and it's called The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. And I have no idea. Let's see. The author is, I don't know. And, but it is fantastic. It's got a little bit of fantasy, which, my partner in crime here, Rick, knows that I share love of fantasy, but, it's got, a little bit of romance and adventure and some history in it. And it was quite a page turner, and I finished it in just a few days. But I definitely got it during a time where the kids left us alone, and it was,
I'm glad to hear.
As opposed to like one really that took me months to read because of time.
So you really liked it? Because that one is on my, I keep a gigantic list actually in Goodreads.
Yeah.
To track, and it's in there. So you're giving me a thumbs up. I should do it.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Do
I enjoyed it. My daughter was like, read it out loud to me. So there was like even a chapter that I read out loud. I have no idea if she took it in, but she was like, oh, but anyways, it was cool. If you like a little bit of, because a little bit of it is fantasy. So if you can, take in that this isn't a realistic fiction, go for it, for sure.
I get enough reality. I'm okay with some fantasy.
Sarah, I'm sure you feel me on the whole got kids, no time to read thing, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I when I'm not reading kids' books, I'm typically reading stuff that's more business oriented, not as much fiction. So I was just reading Radical Candor by Kim Scott. I love that one. I think you can see it. It's this orange one right here on the back of the book. But that one's always really great in terms of just how you're communicating with the people around you. And it's been interesting because I feel like culturally, like most businesses are moving towards just, being very open and honest and transparent. And it's just a good reminder about like how to give feedback in a way that people can listen. So, but when I'm not reading that, I'm a lot of Hungry Caterpillar and Pig the Pug.
I'm going to have to add that one to my list. Radical Candor. I feel like I can get behind that.
Yeah, it's great. Highly recommend it.
I was just grieving recently the loss of the author of the Hungry Caterpillar. We loved it in my house. 17, 18 years ago. We loved that.
It's crazy how old some of these books are. You just think that they're new, but I mean, some of them, they're just have withheld the test of time, like 50 years old.
Right.
Yeah. Because I think he was in his 90s, wasn't he?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. He was up there.
Midnight Moon. So many of these. I'm like, I remember reading those as a kid.
Yeah. Midnight Moon is a classic for us.
Mm-hmm. What do you got, Rick?
I always have a couple books going. One book is on my sci-fi side. It's a brand new one called Breakaway. It's book 12 of the Expeditionary Force, which is this delightful AI that's super intelligent with humans, and they're going against the universe. And it's just wonderful because the AI is this really snarky, super intelligent, and just is always making fun of people. The other one is called Failure to Disrupt. And this book looks at why have there been no disruptions in educational technology and ed tech? Every other field has been disrupted, but what is there in ed tech? Like Blackboard or whatever. And it's just a fascinating read and looking at why the educational system is just so difficult to break and why ed tech has had no Facebook or Google or whatever yet. So that's what's on my
What did they
plate.
say? What's the finding?
Well, there are numerous reasons why, but one of the big ones is when you look at the technology that's been delivered, a lot of it is just taking what's existing and just making it digitized. So nothing really that disruptive there. And the other issue is in terms of education, it's really hard to get teachers to follow through, to adopt new technology. So if they do adopt it, the chances are they're not going to do it the way it's supposed to be done. And sometimes if the school adopts it, they just don't do it. So there's a whole, and plus there's all these other issues that are around digital access. Like some communities, if you're in a poor community, you just don't have the bandwidth to be able to adopt some of these things. So it's a really good read for those of you who are interested into tech.
Yeah. And teachers, I understand. I do get it that it's really hard to take on learning something new, a new skill set when they have so many hours already that are beyond what they thought they probably were going to do when they went to school to be a teacher. They have a lot.
Yep.
To do.
Although my mom's a teacher, and it was amazing. She's never been technologically savvy, but she with COVID, I mean, I saw her use her phone the other day, and I was like, "Whoa!" Like the learning curve. You just kind of had to use it. And she's like so proud of she can share her screen and also teach a live class while teaching a virtual class, and like deal with all the different things happening. And it's just, I mean, night and day from what it was over a year ago.
Wow.
Power of immediate reinforcement, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well,
what do you got, Shannon?
Rick, it's thanks to you. I have been reading in a different key. And
oh, yes.
Yeah. And I'm really embarrassed that I hadn't read it before now that I've started reading it, and it's been around a little while. But it's life-changing to read that. I think it should be required reading. I really do.
Agree.
And I've been so caught up because, Donald Triplett in Mississippi, I feel like I should know everything about the Donald Triplett story. And I was startled. I had no idea about his time on the farm with the Foster family. And it makes me so happy because, first of all, anytime that I can hear anything coming out of the Deep South that is positive and that shows what we're able to do, can do, want to do, that sort of thing, it always makes me very happy. But just the whole message of that piece of the book being that you didn't have to have a master's degree in behavior analysis to look at a person who has a skill set and to determine how can I get this person to use their interests and their skills to do other things that allow them to contribute socially. And, we spend a lot of time thinking and talking about those things, but some ways it's just, are you coming at this question with the desire to do just that? And if you are, you can reason out some ways to do some really good and cool things. So loving it. I'm at the tough part right now though. I'm in the Lobos section. So yeah, it's a little bit harder, but I do. If you haven't read that book and you're listening to me now, read the book.
I purchased Neurotribes, which is a similar book. That one's been really promoted by the neurodiverse community, but kind of gives the same kind of like history of autism and, kind of a scope. And it was written by a guy who's write for the magazine Wired, and he does a really deep dive into it of just the diagnosis itself. I'm only on like the second chapter. I just got it last week, but that too, for if anyone's interested, is kind of a similar book that gives kind of a perspective of the history of autism and its approaches as well.
Carrie, does Steve Silverman have autism himself? I couldn't remember that, but I know I've seen him around IMFAR. Like he goes to a lot of the conferences.
I don't believe that he does.
Mm-hmm. I've also, I like to hear that, so I'll put that one on my list too. But anytime that someone outside of our field is writing about our field or any of the outcomes, like I have a pile of magazines, I think Time or National Geographic, somebody did one on the science of sleep, the science of learning. I just buy them because I want to see what are we telling everybody. But definitely the people in the book that I'm reading have done a fantastic job. I have been amazed at their ability to really understand what we do and why we do it and convey that in just regular language. So
there was awesome. There was a interview. You say Steve Silverman is the author, right? Sarah, of Neurotribes, that he did with an autistic adult who's a self-advocate, but he also has created multiple businesses on the Thinking Person's Guide to Autism on that website. And he is a really amazing interview that talks about kind of the history of this book, but also gets into various cool like job opportunities and how you can include autistics into just professional roles and stuff like that. And it's rather recent. It was posted just a few months ago. So, but the first part of the interview, he gives a kind of a deep dive into how he started the book, which I was like, I've heard of this book. And now after watching this interview, now I just got to buy it. So, that's what kind of led me to take that route.
Well, I guess we should probably pivot and start into some of the meat of the things that we brought Sarah here to talk about. Do you mind just starting with the really basics? Just what is the BHCOE? How is it relating to all of these other professional organizations for behavior analysis?
Sure. So, BHCOE, or Behavioral Health Center of Excellence, we are an accrediting body. And what that really means is just that we create and set standards, and then we measure organizations against those set of standards. And I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about the standard development process at some point in our conversation, but if you haven't done standard development before, it's a pretty extensive process that involves a lot of different stakeholders, a lot of public comment, and really taking into account all the stakeholders that are impacted by those standards. And then we go out and we essentially do an evaluation. So we use like a multimodal approach. We interview, we observe, we look at documents, we survey, staff and patients, we look at turnover outcomes. So we really look at multiple different factors. And then based on that, we use some kind of statistical analyses to identify performance and kind of verification levels, and then provide an accreditation level based on that. So that's kind of who we are. And in terms of, you kind of asked about how we kind of fall into the landscape. And it's funny that you asked that, because we get a lot of questions about the difference between certification versus accreditation versus licensure versus a professional association versus a trade association. And it's one that we, have to answer a lot, because I think, it's important to note accreditation was not something our field really was familiar with prior to BHCOE forming. So we've really kind of led the development of accreditation, but also educated the field a lot about the importance of it. And so the way that I typically describe it is you have a certifying body like the BACB, for example, and their job is to certify individuals. And so they're accredited by an accrediting body themselves that kind of dictates how they do that. And they kind of certify these practitioners like you or me, Carrie. And then we go and we get resources and support from a professional association. And those professional associations can be national, like APBA or ABAI, and they can also be regional, like a state association that I'm sure we're all part of our state associations. And so those professional associations are really there to support the individual practitioner once they've gotten certified. But BHCOE focuses on the organization, which is like the legal entity that employs those practitioners. And so BHCOE is the accrediting body. We hold accreditation ourselves and we accredit the organization. And then those organizations typically are supported with kind of maintaining that accreditation or getting resources, peer support through an organization that's typically called a trade association. And those trade associations can be national. So there's usually national associations that exist. There's also regional ones, right? Like some states have trade associations specific to organizations that work solely in a state. And trade associations typically have the best interest of the providers and they advocate on behalf of the providers. So that, I kind of piece them apart into those 4 different buckets: the certifying body and the professional association that are more individual focused, and then the accrediting body, us, and trade associations, which are more organization focused, if that makes sense.
Helpful and really helps visualize, like pictorially how these things work together.
Yeah, and I have a slide. I didn't pull it up, but I'm happy to share that as well. That kind of showcases the relationship between those as well.
Yeah, we like pretty pictures. It really helps a lot.
We do.
Well, so I think one of the things I want to clarify, if I'm making the assumption right, based on what you were saying, I'm paralleling it to other jobs in other fields and such. So would you say BHCOE is kind of parallel to like JCO in healthcare field? Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. So in other areas of healthcare, accreditation is typically a requirement. In most other areas, because ABA is so new, we haven't really seen that happen yet. I think for a variety of reasons, right? Like we want to make sure we're not limiting access. We're making sure that there's kind of market adoption and that kind of everyone has gone through multiple years of accreditation and kind of verified that the standards are applicable. But yeah, in other areas, the Joint Commission is probably the most popular accreditor for hospital systems or kind of inpatient systems. You also have the Council for Accreditation on Rehabilitation Facilities, or CARF. And that's really focused on residential facilities, kind of group homes. They do have some kind of mental health areas, but to date, there hasn't really been anything specific for ABA other than BHCOE.
Mm-hmm. And so what I'm gathering, because I don't know not nearly as much about accreditation as you do. And I barely know about accreditation. I know more about licensure. And one thing that I've know about is that, like, we really as behavior analysts had to be educated about each step of the way, right? Like when it came to certification, people had to get warm to that. When it comes to licensure, people are still learning about that and are getting warm to that. Like I even a few weeks ago had to explain to somebody that licensure was different than certification and that you weren't just giving up money to the ban and all that kind of stuff, right? And that accreditation is still something separate from that. And I really appreciate your, clarification around that. What I'm gathering, and please, if I'm putting words in your mouth, take them out, is that other professions, this is common. And when other professions are mature, this is how the setup is for protection, for quality of the field, especially when we're dealing with human services. One thing when I was talking about, I was interviewed by Sarah Trotman, and we were talking about licensure and, like to get your nails done by a nail tech, they're licensed. To get your floors redone, you have to have someone who does that from a license. And I think that we're finding something similar here with respect to accreditation, is that these professional fields also come with an accreditation model. Is that correct?
Absolutely. And I think, yeah, licensure is different, right? Because it's typically happening at the state level and is typically kind of guiding the practitioner alongside a certifying body. And we all know we have, the lovely Gina Green to thank for a lot of the important work that's been done around that. But I think this idea of licensure is typically put into place to protect the consumer. And so I typically argue that if you're pro licensure, you probably should be pro accreditation as well, because that's also the goal of accreditation, is really to protect the consumer. And so I would even go as far as to argue that accreditation probably does it a bit better than licensure, because you ultimately, when you license or certify, you do it at the individual level, but then that individual goes and works for a company, typically, unless you're in private practice, which is a lot more rare nowadays in behavior analysis. But especially in the autism field, you're going to go work for an ABA agency. And that agency might create certain contingencies that maybe aren't aligning with your licensure or aren't aligning with your certification guidelines. Or in some cases, they may be okay with you not even holding certification, right? So that individual is no longer even held to an ethics code of some sort, especially with some of the delays that folks have reported related to certification, and kind of the needs to get those people certified quickly. So I would probably argue accreditation assures that organization has certain systems in place to make sure you are requiring appropriate caseloads of your staff and training your people correctly. And, you get certified, but there's this continuing education that needs to happen. And is the organization investing in that? Do they even do things like fire drills? And, do they have a, ADA compliant facility? We work with people with disabilities. You'd be surprised how many facilities we go to that are not ADA compliant. So I think there's just so many more things that are missing in licensure and certification that can really be covered in an accreditation.
I can't agree with you more on that point. As someone who served on the licensing board, and as you mentioned, licensing and certification is attached to the individual, is that when we would receive complaints that were against the agency and that we couldn't then Frankenstein a way that it could then go back to an individual, you had no jurisdiction. You couldn't, investigate the complaint or see it through because of, it was, there was consumer harm because of shady, poor business practices. Like you said, they didn't have a pathway for, this isn't a true story, but let's say it was, there was a fire and they didn't have a proper escape route already planned in place, right? Or something like that. And then someone got harmed and they could have, right? So we, as a board, now granted, I'm sure they're in that terrible example that I gave, there could have been another avenue that somebody could have, could have followed to.
There's also OSHA, right? Like there's like
right,
that kind of
exactly.
state.
There's other avenues.
There's other avenues, but I think the accreditation specifically, yes, there's kind of health and safety stuff that's kind of regulated at the state level anyways. Like as any employer, you need to make sure your employees are safe and all that. But we're looking even deeper than that. So we're looking at like, how do you train your staff? How many hours are you providing them? When's the last time they saw a supervisor? What does your turnover look like? Are your patients actually making progress? I mean, there's 122 items, right, that we look at. Those are just 5 of them. But it's a pretty extensive list that really allows the organization to check where they're at, and then also give their staff and their patients confidence in the type of care that's being provided.
I've got 5 million questions, but let me pause for just a second to do a little bit of business, because we have people watching this for CEU and they really want to know the secret word. So secret word number 1 is standard, not with an S on the end, just standard. Okay. So moving on from what you just said. So it sounds like the things that you're looking for, whereas, okay, so just pulling from my history, because I've never worked as like an ABA clinic. What I have done is a lot of residential care. So intermediate care facilities. And we would have surveyors to come in, and they would have notebooks and like 7 different people from different areas coming in and looking at different things. I just told how old I was, that it was notebooks and not tablets, but they were.
Okay, I started out with notebooks.
I would say that most accepting bodies are still doing notebooks.
Yeah, I know some agencies still working on notebooks. so.
But so they were looking at everything from which way your doors swing, what condiments were on the table, to how did you develop your behavior plan. I mean, everything. So, but for you guys, are you just looking at behavior analytic stuff, or are you also looking at business practices? That's where did these things come from, I guess? Where did
Yeah,
you
great
come up with the indicators?
question. Yeah, so we use a pretty systematic process for standard development. So typically we convene a subject matter expert panel that kind of looks at the research. We do an extensive, environmental scan and literature review that we call an ESLR that kind of informs the first draft of what we do. Oftentimes we'll pilot some of those with some of our existing organizations. So we'll embed some of those questions in the existing accreditation process. It doesn't count towards the score, but we kind of circulate them and understand the response rate to it. And then typically we'll have those go through a public comment. So we'll announce the proposed new standards. We'll, have the public essentially give us all their thoughts, and they always do give us their thoughts. We get, thousands of comments on these things. And then we actually go through and we respond to every single comment that we get in a public forum. So we convene a commission that is made up of about 20 individuals that represent every stakeholder that could be impacted. So people with autism, people of parents of people with autism, payers, the providers. So we have CEOs, we have payers, we have state associations. So CalABA and MassABA are both on our commission. And we essentially have all of those individuals talk through the comment and decide whether they want to accept or reject the comment. And they have to be very particular about why they accept it or why they reject it. And that commenter will get a summary of why they chose to accept or reject each comment. And then it goes through another round of commentary until all comments have been resolved. So ideally, it might go through 2 or 3 rounds of 30 to 45-day public comment period before we even start using them. So that's kind of a roundabout way of saying it's a pretty extensive process to really put them in place. But in terms of the focus, when BHCOE first started, we actually were founded out of a state quality assurance program. So we had a little bit of a blueprint of what it should look like. And the standards have really evolved with the industry. Standards are always living, breathing documents that have to continue iterating. And so I'll just give you a perfect example. When we first launched, we never looked at HIPAA practices. It was just something that we're like, it's state regulated or it's federally regulated. We don't really need to look at it. But more and more we would come out and see that people were not HIPAA compliant. They were using Yahoo accounts or, random AOL accounts. And so we had to add that in, I think 2 years in, because we saw so many egregious HIPAA violations that we weren't able to give feedback on because they weren't in our standards. So to kind of answer your question about the focus is we do look at clinical. That's a huge part of what we do, but we have had to add in some of the administrative or operations components because I think especially with so many clinician-owned organizations, that's an area that a lot of clinicians have never been trained to do. So there's this big debate about clinician owned versus not clinician owned and kind of, is one better than the other? And I can tell you unilaterally that there's no definitive, we haven't seen any variation. If anything, we've probably seen the clinician owned organizations sometimes don't have as many operational or structural processes in place that allow for a bit more streamlined of a process. So we've had to beef up that area to say, great, clinically you're fantastic, but you need to verify benefits before you start treating the patient, right? Or you need to make sure you're using HIPAA compliant software, or that's great that you're taking data on pen and paper, but you can't leave it in the patient's house. You have to actually collect it weekly and do something with it so that if the car is broken into or the house, you have access to 6 months of data. So those are just some of the adjustments we've had to make based on what we're seeing in the marketplace as well.
So once you have those standards, and you said they're a living, breathing document, and I think about a lot of other professions because part of growing and evolving as a profession is having standards and standardization in the whole process. Are there any feedback loops, or do you get any kind of, let's say you have a standard, is there any way when these organizations are operating under these standards, you're like, oh, wow, that's really a bad standard? Like how How's
That's a
that?
great question. Great question. And it's similar to how organizations like the BACB operate. If you've served on any of those subject matter expert committees, oftentimes they show a question and then they'll show you, hey, the majority of people missed this question. Should we throw the question out, right? And so we go through that quarterly. We actually just identified a question where we noted that no one who's gotten through the accreditation process has been able to meet this standard, and therefore clearly the standard's not worded correctly or our scoring criteria is not worded correctly. So we go back in and adjust and autocorrect and then notify the organization that they gained a point that they had thought they lost. So we're continuously looking back at our data and making sure that the standards make sense and that they're utilized appropriately. And not only that there's feasibility, because we can all agree that certain things are important, but in an evolving field, oftentimes, you have to kind of identify like, yes, we want everyone to do X, but the marketplace doesn't allow for that, right? So we're constantly having to adjust.
Okay. Because you said it, I'm going to dive in with it a little. Everybody has their own role in life, and I think mine has more and more been using any opportunity I have when I'm speaking outside of my state to say there are still small people. I mean, and I don't mean small people, I mean small providers. There are states where we don't have large organizations providing most of our services, and quite honestly, we're a little afraid of if they do come in, what's going to happen to the little guys. And so I want to know if accreditation becomes a thing that's very widespread, is that going to leave out the possibility of mom and pop organizations?
I don't think so, only because think about a daycare. I have a friend from college who studied child development like I did, and she started a daycare that has 4 kids, right? Tiny business. She has to go get accredited, right? Because you have kids in your home, right? And she does run her daycare out of her home. And it's always, every time we catch up, I'm like, oh, tell me about the because I'm really curious, what that process looks like versus something like us. And, she's a sole proprietor with 4 children and she has to go through an accreditation process. I think that there's going to be absolutely a culture shift, right? Where I will say, we've spent the last, I say 6 years because that's how long BHCOE has been around. But prior to that, we spent 5 years for the state doing this work. So really, we've spent the last 11 years educating providers about why it's important, why it's needed. And I think we've done a lot of that heavy lifting because it's just something that people need to realize is just the new normal. And accreditation for smaller organizations should be affordable, right? I think that's why you have sliding scales, because if you're a small organization of 10 staff, it should be quite affordable versus if you have 1,000 staff. So I think most accrediting bodies do operate based on size as well to make sure it's cost effective. And then, our organization, and I know others as well, other industries have different levels. So we offer like a preliminary accreditation, which is more administrative in nature, not as burdensome on the organization. It's less costly. It's a little bit more, more about the kind of pen and paper situation that you have versus the observation. So I think there's room for that. But I would definitely say if you're a small organization, you probably want to start off on the right foot too, because ultimately you don't know what you don't know. And the sooner you know what those gaps are, the quicker you can really create kind of a high performing organization.
A lot of your standards public. I mean, there's things that you release often. Yeah. And so a small organization, maybe if they're not ready to put money where their mouth is yet, they know like, okay, so I'm starting out, I'm opening up my door tomorrow. I see these lists of standards. This is what I'm working towards, right? So I'm going to develop this employee manual. I'm going to develop this parent manual, and they're going to have these things in there. And then so as I'm opening up, or before I open up, I'm going to make sure I have these things. And then as I open up, I'm making sure that I have these systems in place. And then come maybe year 2, then I seek accreditation, because then I know that the system is secure, and now I have maybe I've saved a little money aside for that accreditation process, and that it is scalable to meet the size of the organization at that point and stuff like that.
Mhm. Yeah, you have a mix of both. You have some who kind of get all their ducks in a row and they start the process and they have everything ready to go. And those are always really great to work with because we can just give feedback. But then we have some who start the process with nothing, and they start the process and you go, okay, like I'm going to use this as like a task analysis, right? Like every month I set goals with my evaluator, what I'm going to submit, and the evaluator's kind of working with them iteratively. So we certainly have both approaches, and I don't think one is right or wrong. It's just comfort level of the individual.
Do you have any guidance on like how long an organization should be operating before they seek accreditation, or is that something you can do from the get-go?
For the preliminary, we have folks who get started like before they've even taken a patient, right? Because it's administrative in nature. For the full accreditation, we do request that they have at least 15 patients, only because it's more costly. We also do surveys, and the survey that's it's not statistically significant to survey a smaller sample size. So we're just more mindful of wanting them to kind of make sure they're spending their money correctly and, suggest that it's not the best use of funds. But typically it's more about their size than the length that they've been in business.
Well, our CEU word number 2, then I will go ahead and give that one out, is improvement. Improvement.
So I like this talk about improvement and using accreditation to move, the field forward to make it a safe, environment for, like, as you said, if you're for licensure to be protecting consumers, then accreditation really does the same thing. I have to say, like, within the past, and it's probably it's been about a month, maybe a little more than a month, I've had I'm co-owner of a behavioral health agency here in Reno. We are BHCOE accredited, and we recently had 3 RBTs, BCBAs leave us for one reason or another. Most of them moved, and these 3 within a short period of time of them working in another place, and some place that, when you move, you don't really know, and you're Googling and you're online and you interview and places look wonderful. And after, this one girl that I talked to yesterday, she worked there for 2 weeks, find insurance fraud, HIPAA violations. Her BCBA told her to imagine her client, who's 13 years old. Actually, doesn't matter how old this client is. Imagine her client as a puppy. So it's like, there's so many, it's one thing if you're like, I do DTT this way and you do it this way, or I prefer DTT and you're using precision teaching. Like, there's some just gross negligence that is out there. And like I said, I've had 3 occurrences. That hasn't been about preference. That's been about big deals. And all 3 of them are leaving these places. And so I do not think any of these are accredited. I was like, I'm looking them up. So how, like, I feel as if, this is our path forward to be like, okay, like, the more places that are accredited, the less opportunities that we see of these things happening, because, unlike certification where it's like you get your BCBA and you hang that on your wall and you're like, let's not let this baby lapse, right? You have to get reaccredited over and over and over again to maintain that gold star 3-year standard, to let the world know this is a good place of business to the employees. This is a safe place to bring your children or your loved one, regardless of, what clientele you're servicing. And that we're going to, like, the whole system here is working. So,
yeah. Well, I was just going to say, I think I love everything you're saying. The only thing that I will just kind of push back on gently is I just want everyone who's kind of watching this to know too, accreditation doesn't mean the organization is going to be perfect, right? And I think sometimes there's that perspective like, oh, they're accredited, they need to have all their ducks. It just means that the organization is committed to quality improvement, right? It means that there's a feedback loop where if things like that happen, there's someone checking and then they have plans in place how to address those things, right? So it doesn't mean you're not going to have disgruntled employees. It's not going to mean that the organization is going to be perfect. It's that they have a mechanism for checking, are my employees happy? And they're doing it regularly. And there's a feedback loop and an action plan for how to address those issues. And same thing with patients, right? So I agree. I do think that accreditation definitely helps. And not to say if you're not accredited, you won't have those systems, but I think accreditation is just a great way for someone who doesn't know your organization to know that you have those systems. Because otherwise, most organizations kind of all look the same. And they all say that they do things very uniquely and special, right? But ultimately, everyone's saying they're special, so therefore they're all special, right? So they're all the same. So it's just kind of hard to differentiate if I'm an employee who wants to go work for an agency, or if I'm a patient trying to decide which
and it's
agency
kind of
to use
like
for my
that.
child.
I mean, I don't want to compare agencies to used cars, but it's like you can buy a used car without that seal of like, this is a certified used car, right? And that lets you know that it's passed this test, this test, this test, this test. Or you can go out and be like, yeah, I bought it from Kelley Blue Book, and I really hope that, this guy didn't mess up the engine and it's not a lemon or something like that, right? And so it just lets you know. I do like that thing about feedback loop, and that's really, and for sure, like even our own organization, we note all of these other things that we'd like to improve, and just did our strategic goals for next year of things that we want to improve. So of course, but I like how you say, like, it lets you know of that they at least are attending and they get the feedback, and it's an external feedback loop. So it's not biased. We can be like, oh no, we have a great culture. Then someone outside being like, oh, no, you don't. Your employees are kind of grumpy, actually. So
you'd be surprised how many people, like you just mentioned, like technicians who are just like, that place is this or that, and I have no one to talk. I have nowhere to go. And like we do offer a compliance complaint resolution system too. So if someone is accredited, you can file a compliance concern. We'll open up a case, right? And you have to submit evidence, right? Like you can't just say like they hurt my feelings. You need to be able to say like, there was billing fraud, and here's the patient's name, and here's an example where my calendar, I was not there, but they billed up, right? Like, so you need to be able to showcase that, and then we will go to the provider, and they have to respond and kind of prove innocent until proven guilty, but they have to just say, this is actually what happened, or, we did bill, but it's because someone else showed up, right? So then we kind of investigate with a disciplinary review committee that's blind, right? So they have no conflict of interest with the organization, but they're also BCBA's business owners or in leadership roles, and they kind of look at all the facts, and they kind of look at what's in the best interest of the consumer, the patient, and then they basically make a decision, and we give that back to both parties. And, we've had situations where the provider goes, oh my God, thank you for letting us know. We didn't know this was happening. This wasn't approved, right?
Well,
and so we work with them to mediate
that type of response as opposed to.
Yeah.
Well, if you
We always joke that we are the best people to come to an organization with a compliance concern. What you don't want is that to come from a payer, from the state, from the government. Like we are the nicest compliance concern people you will ever deal with. And it's a good exercise because we're in this new medical model. We're not we're not educational. We're not private pay anymore. And there are real rules and contingencies to those types of issues.
Do you, let's say you have a disciplinary review and the complaint is substantiated and it is in violation of some legal matter. I mean, do you do more sometimes than just talk to the organizations? Do you have to do that?
Yeah, actually, on our website, I can pull up a link too. You can see every single disciplinary action that we've received, and then how we dealt with it. So we will only publish the name if we've had to revoke or suspend accreditation. Typically, we don't publish the name unless it's something egregious. But every time we get a compliance concern, the goal is to coach the organization into compliance. So we're not going to come to the organization and say, how dare you, you're out. It's more like, hey, this happened. This came to our attention. Can you let us know what's going on here? We would love you to make these changes to your policies, or we want you to be aware that this was complained against you. And, even though you were innocent, be aware that this is the perception. So you may want to, change your messaging or whatever it might be. Right. And then sometimes something that's less egregious, it might just be an advisory letter. Like, we were made aware that you're, using our logo incorrectly, right? It says you got a 3-year, but you actually got a 1-year. Please change that, right? And we're going to check in 30 days if it's complete, right? So there's really just variations as to how we'll deal with it. But we always kind of publicly report how that's going.
Well,
as well.
I've been hearing.
So do you have standards for who loses or what happens? Does it have to be egregious, or you're a multiple offender? How does someone come on the wrong side of accreditation?
Yeah, that's a good question. So that's typically left up to the disciplinary review committee, but typically something like that will be reserved if a patient was severely harmed. So if there's death or injury, abuse, that's like a very good one, or just extreme negligence. So ideally, we've had organizations who have had abuse happen within their organization on their watch. But we look at not did it happen, but how did you deal with it, right? Because that's what accreditation allows you to do, is have systems for it. So the minute you learned about it, did you call the police? Did you report it? Did you terminate that person? Did you open an investigation? Did you notify the families, right? So we're looking at all of those things and saying, you did everything right. This person went rogue, or kind of, went out of the scope of what we would hope they would do. But as an organization, you handled it perfectly. But then you have situations where that happens, and, you find out that the provider told the family, and then the family was told, don't talk to the police and don't tell anyone. Right. So it's how you handle it that really is a determining factor.
That makes sense. Well, when you were talking about earlier, all the benefits to becoming accredited, it seems like, I don't know, I guess part of me wants to ask a two-part question. One is, I do that a lot too. I need to stop it. But do you think we're moving towards a time where accreditation is going to be mandatory? And is that going to be aligned with the value-based care movement in any kind of way?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we are already seeing accreditation become required in some states and across some payers. So oftentimes that's done without our involvement. We just learned of a payer, in the South that is like, you can't become a network unless you're BHCOE accredited. And that's very cool to see that. So we see that and we go, okay, the payers want that. What I will say is I think we're facing like a broader access issue, right? So making sure patients aren't limited to access. But I think one of the pieces that BHCOE cares a lot about is we want to make sure we're never limiting access. So we have never gone out and said you should require accreditation, because we want to be very mindful of patients getting access to care. But I think we are very cautious about trading access for quality, right? Because what you don't want is you suddenly have this open access, but there's very poor quality, like Carrie, like someone's telling you to imagine your kid is a puppy, like at what point is access kind of, balancing the needs of the patient, right? So I think absolutely value-based care is the way to deal with that. And we just announced some partnerships we have with payers, where payers are really looking to create these value-based care programs in an industry where, while we love data, we know that we've struggled with communicating the value of that data outside of the industry, right? Because we're really good at taking kind of granular data, but when you're looking bigger picture, payers don't know what to do to kind of incentivize providers. So we have some payers that are using the BHCOE accreditation standards as a metric for value-based care. So they're essentially putting together a pay-for-performance program where if you're accredited, you get a slightly higher reimbursement rate, or if you're accredited plus these other 2-3 standards, that's what you need to do. So I think that's a really exciting part. And I think I showed you all an image at some point of this kind of value-based care continuum. But, as value-based care moves down the road, what you're going to see is you're going to have hopefully higher quality, but also higher risk for the provider. And right now we can't really get to kind of the extreme level of the the kind of value-based care systems we want, but we have to start with like a pay for performance of some sort. And you're already seeing the market move in that direction.
Our last secret word is audit, AUDIT.
I think value-based care is going to impact us in so many different ways. And I'm always an optimist, so I think more on the positive side. All you have to do is look at healthcare and see how is value-based care. I mean, we're part of healthcare, but I'm talking about like medical doctors and nurses and that part of the healthcare. And one thing I'm very interested in myself, I have argued for years that we need standards when it comes to how we measure, how we assess, and how we display and communicate our data. And I sometimes think that might be somewhere where we're actually going to move to eventually within our field, that value-based care is going to push forward standards. If you look at, again, if we talk about the medical community, and they have all kinds of standard measures, and those standard measures are known, they are accessed, they're shared with people. Even the patients or the clients themselves will know what those are. So I wonder how at least standards are in terms of the measurement side and the visual display and all of that are going to impact behavior analysis as we move more towards value-based care and looking at how that works with standards.
I'm glad you brought that up, because we talked a little bit about standard development at BHCOE, but we're also have been working really heavily on measure development as well, in the line of what you're mentioning, which is how do we really specify measures that we're using to display outcome and display process and structure. So that's something that we've been pretty open about, that we're in development of. And depending on when everyone hears this particular episode, we're almost complete with a kind of a lengthier white paper on assessment selection as well, because I think there's just a lot of room for improvement there as to why do I use one assessment versus another, and what are the pros and cons of all these assessments, and some of the quality measures that we need to take into account, and criteria of our patients and our employees and staff member when doing that. So I'm excited to share that, but I couldn't agree more, Rick, that that's definitely the direction that we need to go in as an industry.
I love this line of conversation, because there's even lack of standardization, yes, about our measurement, but about even, I know some agencies that aren't collecting aggregate clinical data, and so, I mean, and, whether it be mom and pop, and I get that you're overwhelmed because you're like, I got so many things going on, but it's also like, larger agencies who are amazing at collecting aggregate business data. But then when you go to collect clinical data, it's like, well, I don't know. So it's just like, it's really hard to then say like, okay, so how is this transition actually going to work if even a single agency doesn't have the standardization or the systems in place to collect their own clinical data to evaluate outcomes at a grander level, then, doing so, like we can do so as a field at like greater levels, and I know that that's something that you guys are working at BHCOE, but I think that it's even, I think there's going to be some agencies where this transition is just going to be like really tough, because even conceptualizing aggregate clinical data is foreign to them at this point. And so
what you all are doing is so important at CentralReach, because ultimately you're creating a platform to facilitate some of that and create some ease and comfort around it too. So I'm not sure if you all are working on something beyond just the kind of single subject design type data sets. But that's something that I think is much needed in the field. And, like I said, when we ask for aggregate data, people are using Excel sheets, right? And that's not, we're you're used to storing big data sets.
Right.
But I think, again, the white paper that we're putting out will also talk about kind of data cleanliness and data storage and how do you work with these large data sets as well, because I think there's a lot of, there's just a lot of knowledge that we need to continue sharing with each other.
Something that came into my mind as you guys were talking. So maybe I need to loop all the way back to the beginning. Who are you accrediting? Like, who is, and let me clarify why I'm asking, and then maybe it helps to answer the question. One of the problems I see, or gray areas, when we start requiring licensing and credentialing of providers, and we say, if you're providing ABA services, that you have to be licensed and credentialed. ABA services have two different meanings depending on your background, I think. And people like me say, a lot of people are doing ABA services. And if you say you have to have a license to do ABA, did Donald Triplett's foster parents practice ABA without a license? Do teachers who have just a special education degree practice ABA without a license? So there's been a lot of need to kind of clarify who has to be licensed and who has to be credentialed and who doesn't. So are you looking only at clinics serving an autistic population, an age range? Can you?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, and also, I don't know if you all heard the great news about New York State licensure removing the scope. So that just passed in the Senate, I think yesterday or the day before.
Oh, I didn't hear that.
Yeah.
That's fantastic.
Yeah,
Wow.
in the wake of kind of scope of, I think you're asking like scope of competence, scope of practice type questions. I think, so we focus specifically on the therapeutic approach, which is applied behavior analysis. We're not looking at the diagnosis. We're not looking at the age range. The standards that we have in place should apply independent of those things, right? But we look at form, function, not form. So some of those standards they have slightly different scoring criteria based on whether you're working with adults or children, whether you're in a home-based versus center-based program. But we're looking at the modality, applied behavior analysis. We're not looking at, do they have Down syndrome or autism?
Okay. It doesn't matter where they're delivering the services.
Yep. Some of those things might look different. So for example, safety checklist. If you're working in the home, you want to make sure there's no knives out, that you know where the exit plan is. If you're working in the center, your safety checklist is going to look a little different. If you're in the community, you should have like an escape, if the child elopes, what the safety plan. So it's going to look different. Yeah. Exactly.
Shannon, that was really a good question. And you made me think about something. Most payers are looking for parents to be involved. And how far does that involvement go? I mean, at what point should providers be teaching parents to do discrete trial instruction and doing like where is the line of, when they start encroaching upon what we think of as the delivery of services for
I love that question, because I think as a field, payers have gotten frustrated with whenever parent training comes up, all I hear providers yell is mental health parity law, right? And people just kind of yell and say, like, you can't ask us to do that, right? And I think as someone who's kind of on the sidelines watching these discussions, what I hear payers saying is, and I agree with this approach, I think I'll abridge it a little bit, is we know that when parents are involved, patients have better outcomes, right? The research supports this, and we know that that's the case, right? And so the feedback that, like in our standards, we look to see, are you requiring parent involvement at some level based on patient need, based on the parent's availability, based on all these other factors? And if not, I would say that's a problem, right? Like, I think there should be some base. If we know that the research shows that patients have better outcomes when parents are involved, that should just be standard operating procedure for you as a clinician, right? Now, I think that what we see in the field is if a parent asks to be involved, that's when they get involved, right? The baseline should be everyone gets involved and people don't participate if for some reason there's some factors like they have multiple children in the home, they have a mental health issue themselves, they're working 10 jobs, right? So I think those are some factors why you should exclude them from participation. But I think the baseline should be including them in participation and having exclusion criteria, not no one gets it unless they ask, and therefore it's inclusion criteria. And the inclusion criteria is usually the squeaky wheel of a parent, or the parent who's like, probably maybe more better at communicating, better for advocating for their child.
And I 100% agree. And just putting up conditional warnings is that like you said, let's be sensitive to those. I have this one child with autism, but then I also have these 3 other kids, and then I'm the only mom, and we are human beings. We want to be sensitive to these, external contingencies and variables that may lessen the time, the accessibility, the intersectionality of that. This is not just a parent of a child with autism, but they also have to be the sole provider of that family, or right, they have to be the caregiver of other children and stuff like that. And then, so I don't think that their role should be the RBT,
Agreed.
They getting them involved and having them do things. And I had a client where she would do everything under the condition was the RBTs and absolutely nothing with mother. So we definitely had to work on mom running some programs and work on that generalization, because it just wasn't magically happening. So we had to directly target that. So there's definitely that. And then there's, some amazing programs that, shift where, the child is at risk because of severe problematic behavior of being pulled from the home. And so they have to do intensive parent training models in those type of situations, because the therapist isn't going to be around all the time. And so therefore the parent has to be actively involved in those situations. If not, the child, for example, in Nevada, there's not many programs in there, so they would be shipped out of state, and so there's some nuances there. But I do want to just put up the cautionary warning, especially when we get in talking about insurances and where they might go, is just that I want to respect the role of the parent, because even after going through COVID and having to wear multiple hats of being parent and teacher, and is that sometimes when you put multiple hats on, those hats bleed and you're going to fail across the board. And so sometimes you just have to be parent and let someone else be the RBT, and then teach you the good skills of okay, now let's do it this way, and now let's perfect this. You can still be mom, and we still need you to do these things as mom, but having you be mom and the RBT, may not be the role.
Thanks. Yeah. Thanks for softening that for me. I think in no way was I assuming the parent should be the RBT, but I agree with you. There needs to.
I just wanted to, and I just always have to be if an insurance company is listening, this is not what we're saying.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say too, for clinicians as well, is so if you find a parent who, just doesn't have the capacity to participate, there's, multiple factors going on, document it, right? I think that's the frustration I'm seeing, is it's not mentioned anywhere that this is something that is or isn't happening. If it isn't happening, why isn't it happening? And there should be a good reason for it. And it's okay if there's a good reason for it, right? I have, as someone who's worked on the payer side, I've rarely seen denials based on we've tried to have them participate, but we can't for these factors, right? It's more that, there's no parent involvement. There's tons of behaviors happening outside of the home, outside of session, and we can't figure out why, right? And, we need to make that bridge.
There's no attempt to get a parent involved.
Well, or no documented attempt.
Right.
And so that's a thing. And we know it's a pain point because people talk about it all of the time, but it brings up for me, and then we don't have time because we are about to wind up, but another discussion later is training behavior analysts to be behavior analysts. And that doesn't just mean the person that the direct learner, right? So if this is a pain point and you don't know why it's happening, then maybe we need to learn how to analyze why the parent isn't able to participate. Well, can I ask one quick question before we wrap up, Sarah? Just it will be a simple one. I just noticed that you're using the word patient a lot, and we talk a lot about terminology. So why are you selecting that? Is that the BHCOE term?
That's a great question. So we actually refer to patients and then parents/caregivers as the individuals who are the recipients of care. I think that kind of comes from just what the literature is looking at right now. I think the term consumer can be a little bit, I think the term that I've heard is degrading, right? Like you're consuming something, or you're kind of pulling on resources. But yeah, that's kind of just knowing that the field has really moved into the medical model. That's kind of what we've really stuck to. But I'm curious, what do you all use language-wise internally? Learner?
For all of our curriculum, we use learner.
Yeah, and it's funny because we definitely have talked about that term, but that tends to be more educational in nature. And so the learner is typically like in a school system appropriate to use. And so we've kind of stuck to something that could be a bit more all-encompassing, especially knowing that AD is a medical treatment, even if it is being delivered in the school.
Yeah. And coming from the ID adult world, the word has changed so many times just in my X number, I won't say, of decades. So it's always interesting to me to hear what the thinking is.
It will change again in our lifetime. So.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, Sarah, thank you so much for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation, and I really learned a whole lot.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for having me. This was fun. I enjoyed it. Good to see you all.
Everyone for joining us.
And thank you for the good work that you guys are doing and helping to make our field and landscape a safer place for the families and patients that are receiving care through ABA. I think that's
and employees. Don't forget employees.
Yes, and and so for better working conditions for employees too, for sure. I mean, Lord knows that this is a hard industry. It can burn someone out. And so having those protections and guardrails in there to make sure that we have happy people all around is definitely a great thing for our field. So thank you.
Yeah, it's been a lot of fun. And, we have some exciting work coming down the road and can't wait to continue sharing more.
Excited to see that.
Thanks for watching this episode of The Behavioral View. To get your CEU, follow the link in the instructions below. You can then go to the attendance verification quiz where you'll enter in the secret words and pay the CEU fee to generate your certificate. You've already done the work, you may as well get the credit.